Welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam. My name is John Roberti. Today's topic is too much influence. Consumer protection for online reviews and influencers. The question we're going to talk about today is, how can you tell if a review is truly genuine? Who's regulating? Who's watching? And most importantly, how can you make a good decision when you read an online review? My co-host today is Elyse Dorsey. Hi, Elyse.
Hey, John.
At least for me as a consumer, online reviews have been amazing. I am shopping for things that I know nothing about, but as I read them, I'm always a little bit skeptical, even as I find them to be very helpful. Who's looking after the consumer protection angles for online reviews?
Yeah, so the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has jurisdiction in this area, and it's been one where they've been active for a long time. Like you said, online reviews and social media especially have really caused this to become a much bigger issue than I think it has been historically. But the FTC for a long time has kind of been looking into this and making sure consumers, if they're reading reviews, they can trust them. I mean, that's a big part of how we decide what we're going to buy is, relying on other people. So we want to make sure they're trustworthy.
Well, great. Who is our guest today?
Our guest today is Lauren Aronson. Lauren is a vice chair of the Consumer Protection Committee at the ABA Antitrust section, and she is also counsel at Crowell & Moring. And
Elyse, what are we hoping to get out of this conversation today?
I think we're hoping to get from Lauren like a better idea of just kind of what it looks like today, what the FTC is doing, what firms are doing, anything we as consumers should know when we're going in and looking at these kind of reviews.
Well, great. Let's bring in our guest, Lauren Aronson. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So kind of high level, I guess, how do you think about consumer protection in this space?
Okay, so as you said, the FTC's authority, it comes from Section 5 of the FTC Act, and the FTC can enforce against practices that are unfair and deceptive. About 10 years ago, when the internet was really taking hold and we saw the rise of, quote unquote, mommy bloggers, the FTC issued its updated testimonial and endorsement guides. And that guidance indicates what the FTC would consider to be a possible deceptive practice. And since then, we've seen a lot of different closing letters and cases, initially involving influencer marketing targeted at brands. We saw some ad agency cases and also some advertising network cases. But more recently, we've also seen cases specifically focusing on and targeting consumer reviews. So when thinking about these cases, the endorsement guides really focus on three core principles, that endorsements must reflect the honest opinions and beliefs and experiences of the endorsers. They can't say anything that the advertiser can't say on their own. The endorsement must also, if there's any sort of what they call a quote-unquote material connection between the advertiser and the endorser, that must be clearly and conspicuously disclosed to the consumer. So taking those principles together, that's where we've really seen the core of the FTC's activity.
And so what kind of things would be material? What was the term you used?
Material connection.
Yeah.
So the FTC has taken a very sharp view of that might be a surprise for many advertisers. What you would ordinarily think of as a material connection, you would think, well, maybe there's payment. But it's not just that. The FTC looks at any sort of benefit or discount. They'll get free products. It could be a sweepstakes entry. It could even be a consumer who might be reviewing a product because they think that their review might get them a spot in a television commercial. So it's really any sort of thing that could potentially impact the credibility of the review, but that the consumer would not reasonably expect or anticipate.
I think all businesses would want to get a good review for their product. What can they do? What can't they do?
Well, so the FTC has really set up a lot of different guidances, not just in the endorsement guides, which I just mentioned, and also through cases and settlements, but also they have frequently asked questions, which they've updated periodically, most recently about a year ago. And, you can see a framework for what they cannot do. So basically, it's okay, assuming platform rules allow it, for you to reach out to your customers and say, hey, leave me a review. But what you can't do is take steps to influence the review in a way that doesn't properly reflect what the consumer's actual experience is with the product. And you also can't pay the consumer or give them free stuff in exchange for a review without disclosing that relationship. And then finally, outside of the FTC scope, you also have to think about what different platforms allow. So for example, Amazon and Yelp, two of the most common review sites, they actually don't allow any sort of incentivizing of reviews. Not only can you not purchase them at fake reviews, which is always going to be illegal, but you also can't give people discounts or coupons or sweepstakes entries on those sites in exchange for reviews. So you have to consider both of those angles. But there's still some leeway. You can have reviews that come to the sites organically, and you can also just tell consumers that you would appreciate it.
So Lauren, let me get this straight. So I can't incentivize somebody to put in any review. Suppose I went to them and said, hey, I don't care what you say about me, but I just really want you to review me, and I'll give you a discount if you do.
You can, but assuming the platform rules allow it, you can do that, but they have to disclose that clearly and conspicuously to their audience. So in the review, it must be right up front. So actually, in June, we saw the FTC and the FDA issue joint letters to companies in the vape space. And while the letters, part of what they focused on was the failure of influencers and endorsers to disclose the health risks involved in vaping and also the addictive quality of the tobacco in the products, the other piece of the letters related to the disclosure requirements. So the FTC has taken the strong position that the disclosure must be right up front, cannot be buried in a series of hashtags or links. And you have to think a lot about the platform itself too. So if you want people, assuming that you want them to leave a review on Instagram, you can't have them do it on Amazon. It's against the rules. But you would have to tell them that disclosure must say that you got free product or sweepstakes entry, whatever it might be. It must be what the FTC calls above the fold. So that means that it has to be above where you click more. And on Instagram, that's actually only the first 2 lines. And the FTC would make sure to point that out in the letters. And you can't just stick it at the end in a long chain of hashtags. And depending on the platform or where you're having the consumers leave the review, you can certainly customize it. But you have to tell the consumer, I'm going to give you a sweepstakes entry, but part of the entry requirement must be, something like, I don't know, water sweeps or whatever it is that you happen to be selling. And then if you're giving them free stuff, they have to say that.
Okay, so is that why, like on Instagram, I spend a lot of time on Instagram now. You kind of see at the beginning, sometimes they'll like tag it almost as sponsored, or like it'll start with hashtag ad and then there'll be the actual content.
That's definitely best practice. So the actual content of the disclosure will depend on the relationship. So you'll see a lot hashtag ad where there is an influencer hired, a social media influencer, for example, or a celebrity using their personal Instagram page to promote products. And that's a simple and easy way to do it right up front is best practice. If it's a free product, it might be like something like, I loved this soft drink. It was so delicious. Thanks for the free gift or something like that. It really will depend on the circumstances of what it is that you're asking the consumer to do. So in general, like the stronger the connection, the more likely it is that you might need to say something like ad. If it's just somebody getting a sweepstakes entry or a coupon or some other free incentive, it doesn't need to say ad, but it does need to explain the nature of the relationship.
Great. So why don't we talk about some of the cases that have come up recently? We've heard about cure encapsulations. Can you go into that?
Sure. So this one, the FTC announced a settlement with this company about in February or March. And this one related to a practice that we're calling astroturfing. A couple of years ago, we first saw this with the New York Attorney General looking into this. This most recent case really squarely involved Amazon reviews. This company was selling a Garcinia Cambogia extract and making all sorts of different claims about cravings and losing weight. And they were also paying another company called AmazonReviews.com to pose as real consumers and leave 5-star reviews. So the case involved a variety of issues. They also involved, I believe, some auto-renew issues. But relevant here was the FTC focused on this issue of paid reviews, because people really do rely on reviews when making purchases. And the reviews made false claims about the performance of the products. They didn't reflect the authentic experiences of the users. They were not real users. And of course, consumers had no idea about the payment. So as part of the settlement, there was a judgment of $12.8 million, which was suspended. And in addition, the company has to send email notices to people who bought the product, detailing to them that there were fake reviews on Amazon. And also, they have to notify Amazon itself about the fact that they purchased fake reviews and identify them and have them removed.
I have not seen a lot of the disclosures that you've talked about, and maybe I'm looking in the wrong places. But does that suggest to me either that there aren't a lot of paid reviews going on, that people have sort of stepped away from that, or people aren't following the guidance? What do you think?
I think it's more of the latter. And I think that also explains a large part of why we've seen a pretty quick succession of review cases, specifically focusing on the consumer reviews aspect from the FTC over the past couple of months. There are a lot of companies, particularly places like Amazon, which enable companies which are smaller that wouldn't really have the ability to reach a large number of consumers, all of a sudden ending up on a platform with a trusted, 5 gold star review system, using that in order to reach more and more consumers. So we are seeing a lot of reviews, and I think the vast majority of them aren't being disclosed. And add into that the platforms themselves, like Yelp and Amazon, have tried to clean up their reviews and to help consumers maintain the level of trust they have by banning incentivized reviews altogether, with a few exceptions. Like Amazon does still have their Vine program, but outside of that, you're not allowed to use these platforms for reviews. So you're just not seeing them. And then finally, you might see advertiser websites. They might have consumers leaving reviews which may be incentivized, and then these reviews get syndicated onto other websites. So you'll see the same reviews replicated over and over again. So even if, say, there was some sort of a disclosure on the website, that disclosure may not actually travel with the review when it shows up on other third-party websites. So all of this added together, the companies adding so much importance on the consumer reviews, the fact that there are companies that simply don't know what the rules are, and then finally the syndication of the reviews really means that there's quite a lot. We don't know how many, but there's quite a lot of reviews out there that aren't complying with the guidelines.
So should we be worried when we're looking at these reviews that maybe they've been influenced and we aren't aware of it yet? Are there, things that we can look for as consumers to maybe help track?
Well, I think it's always good when you're looking at any sort of information on the internet to look at it, carefully thinking about what the source is or who the source is. But there's certainly certain hallmarks. There are, websites out there, for example, where you can enter in a review if it seems a little bit odd, that they have an exceptionally high star rating. If you've never heard of this company, generally that's a red flag to see what's going on. Also, if there's an unusual number of reviews, that's another way to kind of tell that there may be some sort of incentivizing of the reviews going on. Generally, consumers, it takes work to leave reviews. So consumers generally will do it either when they love a product or when they hate a product or have a bad experience. But if you're seeing a relatively unknown brand with thousands of reviews on Amazon, that's generally a pretty big red flag. And also, it's important to actually look at the reviews and read them. Sometimes it's impossible to read all of them, given the sheer number that you may see. But sometimes here and there, consumers may mention that they got something for free just because they mentioned it, even if they weren't instructed to. So that's another flag. Also, if you see a lot of reviews with first-time reviewers, again, people are unlikely to leave reviews. So if this person left one review and that's all you see, it could either mean that they were incentivized with free stuff, could mean it's fake. So those are some different options, that you might see. So there are various red flags. It just takes time. And the reality is a lot of consumers aren't willing to invest the time it takes to figure out what's a real reliable review and what isn't.
Can we talk about influencers for a second?
Sure.
I actually didn't know that was a thing until fairly recently. But there actually is regulation at the FTC over influencers, right?
Yes, and it's really related to what we're seeing here. So that's really, again, about 10 years ago is when we really saw the beginning of this. The mommy bloggers were kind of those original non-celebrity influencers, because these people, people like to think of them as people like you and me taking pictures in their bedroom and in their house, and they're living lives that are theoretically similar to yours. And so because they're more like you, people have a tendency to trust the products that they recommend and talk about a bit more than you would trust your traditional celebrity, because there's sort of that sense of familiarity. And so back 10 years ago, when the bloggers were getting big, they were starting to get brand deals because companies were noticing that they've got this level of authenticity that the television actors and actresses or models might not have. So as a result, the FTC made clear in the updated guides that the requirements about honest reviews, disclosing, and so forth apply to influencers when that connection is unanticipated. Now, there's still, some lack of clarity. It's still a lot of influencers may not actually be disclosing the relationships. There's a lot of questions about, well, what do consumers really understand at this point, 10 years later? They know that some of the people that are really big, they are kind of like quasi-celebrities, and they're living these fabulous lives and like doing their makeup in private planes and stuff like that. But they're still, they do sometimes talk about things that they like for free. So it's still hard for the consumer to tell what is a real and genuine bona fide endorsement, and what is one that, even if they're, assuming hopefully they're telling you what they really think about a product, but they might be getting paid, and sometimes large sums of money are being exchanged here. Tens of thousands, sometimes in the six figures or even more, is being exchanged to get some of the big influencers to talk about products or brands. So that's why this has been really an ongoing focus for the FTC, and we can definitely expect to see it in the future. And the recent warning letters I mentioned from June related specifically to the influencer space. We had some online Instagram influencers talking about vaping brands, and they were doing so without disclosing those connections.
Great. Can I ask you quickly, how much of the burden is on, say, the platform, Instagram or Facebook, versus the individual influencers?
So I would say that the core requirements are primarily on the brand and the influencer. So both of them. So the brand has the obligation to have a policy in place, for example. So the FTC has made clear we want to see some sort of a social media policy. Generally, they should have an agreement with the influencer highlighting what the influencer's obligations are, like what they can say about the product, meaning what they cannot, and also what they cannot say, only because once you're hiring an influencer, as a brand, you're responsible for all of the claims that the influencer is making about the product, just as if you're making them yourself. So you have to tell them like what claims are supported and what ones aren't supported. But you also want them to talk about their honest impressions, beliefs. You have to tell them like that they have to disclose. They have an obligation to do it, what the disclosure should look like. You don't necessarily have to provide the exact language, but, where in the video should it be, or where in the caption, or where on the Instagram post should it be? So all of that should be part of the agreement. And we've seen in various settlement orders that the FTC is expecting to see that. Also, you see an influencer not following the rules. In some of the settlement orders that we've seen, the FTC expects they might be able to give a warning if it was an inadvertent issue, but if they're a repeat offender, you got to cut them loose, because all of that elevates the brand's risk of exposure. And the influencer also theoretically has exposure. We really haven't seen enforcement activity against the influencers. We have seen, there's one case, there was a settlement agreement involving T. Martin, some gamers, and that was kind of touted as the first influencer case, but they also were brand owners, so it wasn't like a pure influencer case. And about a year ago, we also saw a bunch of warning letters go out to influencers because the FTC perceived a lack of disclosure. And it interestingly underlined some of the problems here, because afterwards, once the influencers responded, a percentage of them weren't actually sponsored posts. Some were, some weren't. And that really underscores the importance of the disclosures. It's hard to tell sometimes when they're talking about a brand. So both parties really have the obligations here. The platforms, they don't have necessarily the information, but, it remains to be seen if there could be some sort of of requirement. We've seen also the FTC go after the networks which connect influencers to brand. We saw that in the Machinima case, for example. We've seen them go after ad agencies. We saw that in Deutsch LA, where employees were talking about a product launch without disclosing that they work for the ad agency related to the launch. So if it's a party that plays a role in developing the advertisement, there is some liability there, but most of the cases have been brand related.
Great. Well, this has been super interesting, Lauren, and it's clear you're very passionate about consumer protection law. Could you just, before we wrap, kind of what is it about consumer protection law that you enjoy?
Well, it's fun to be on the side of the good guys. We're advising companies and we're trying to help them make sure that their marketing and advertising is compliant. And, we're also working with them if they spot issues. One thing I want to mention really quickly before we drop also is that the FTC is one piece of it, but also in our space, we have the National Advertising Division, which is an industry self-regulatory body. They have been involved in a ton of cases related to influencers. So, it's an issue for, our clients. If they're playing by the rules and a company isn't, it can hurt their bottom line. So, there are these other available forums there as well for companies to act if they feel that there's something going on in the space that could be hurting them competitively. But, it's a good thing, I think, to really try to educate companies, marketers, on what's the right thing to do.
Lauren, let's find out a little bit about something about you. Tell us something surprising or unusual about yourself.
I don't know if it's surprising, but I do have a I don't really watch TV. I'm always looking on Instagram, YouTube, maybe it's because I have teenagers, or maybe it's just because of what I do day in and day out. But I actually watch a lot of Instagrammers and YouTubers myself.
Well, what's your favorite?
Kathleen Lights. She's a beauty guru from Cuba in Miami, and I don't know, I relate to her a little bit, because my mom is actually from Colombia, and I just like watching people with a very different life than mine. Could you imagine lawyer influencers? That would not be the most exciting thing.
I actually was sort of hoping for a job doing that, but let's turn to our last segment, which is the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
So, Lauren, in this hat we have a number of questions. Pull one out. I'll ask you a question. I'll also ask you a follow-up.
All right. Let's see.
Okay. Okay, this is a good one. Are there any TV series that you are watching or binge watching right now?
I've been watching Outlander. So that's on Starz. I read all of the books. Oh, gosh. A long time ago. Diana Gabaldon's the author, and she hasn't released a new one in several years. But now it's a TV show on Starz, so I have been watching that, eagerly awaiting the start of the next season. So it's about time travel. So
yes. Time travel in Scotland?
It is. So it's about a nurse from World War II who somehow fell between these stones in Scotland and ended up in the 1740s. So it's ridiculous. The plot is completely ridiculous, and it's completely unbelievable. And everyone almost dies, and they somehow survive. But it's a fun show to watch, and I've always really liked history, and especially history from the early modern to the Restoration period. So it allows me to watch something completely mindless while also making me feel not ridiculous, because at least I'm learning a little something about the historical period.
All right, so then let me ask you this follow-up question.
Okay.
What is your guilty pleasure TV show? A TV show that if it's really just us here, so you wouldn't admit to anybody other than, say, Elyse and me that you really watch.
And the broader audience?
Yeah, I think it's the lawyer influencer shows on YouTube.
There's none of that, as far as I know. Yeah, that was my guilty pleasure. I admitted it right away. I like to watch random beauty videos on YouTube.
Well, after our discussion, I appreciate how forthright you were.
All right, well, Lauren, thank you. That will do it for today's show. We will be back next week with our next episode of Our Curious Amalgam. We hope that you will join us again then. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by the ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent those of their employer or other organization. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. If you have suggestions for topics or are interested in participating in a future episode, please reach out to us at ourcuriousamalgam@americanbar.org. Until next time, thank you for listening.